everyone, this is Lindsika Adventurer, and my name is Lindsay, and we are going to be adventuring through some Bible stories every Friday, and today is Friday, so we are going to do this again. So I did try to video this earlier and upload it, but technology and I are not friends, so let's try this through a live stream. Please let me know if you're watching, where you're coming from, and if you have any questions. Today we are talking about Genesis chapter 15 and the covenant that that God made with Abraham, and really what was going on, because that was honestly, if you've ever read Genesis 15, you may have just skipped over it because you think, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening in this chapter. It doesn't make any kind of sense. So I'm just going to move on to something that makes a bit more sense. So let's try and make a bit of sense out of this, shall we? Where did I put my Bible? I'm going to grab my Bible because I put it somewhere else. Okay, I'm back. All right. So let's just start in chapter 15, verse 1. So it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward. So I just really want to, jump right in. And on this first verse, kind of let you know some of the things that I've been thinking, some of the things that have kind of jumped out at me over the past week of reading this. So this whole, I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward. That sounds pretty cool. Like God is saying, I am the thing that you should want more than anything else. Like I am here, I'm protecting you, and I am your greatest heart's desire, basically. And yet what happens here is Abram says, but Lord, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And then he says it again in a different way, saying, then Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. So God has started off by saying, hey, I'm your heart's desire, I'm over here. And Abram's like, but I have no kids. And he immediately just focuses on the thing that he doesn't have. And I've been really feeling this past week. God has really been showing me that I have not been putting him first and as my heart's greatest desire. Obviously, that is the thing, that is the void that is missing within all of us, is God and his love in our life, and chasing after him. And we kind of try to fill that with all these other things, and basically become idol worshippers of friends, of family, of things, of money, of whatever else it could be. For me, it's been a combination of some of these things, and God has been really dealing with me on this past week. And it's been very uncomfortable, but very, very necessary. And so so God's like, I'm your heart's desire, basically. And Abram is saying, but God, what are you going to give me? I want a kid. He's now 75 years old, and his wife is 65 years old at this point. So they're way past the point where they can actually have kids. And so he's given up entirely, saying, what does my life come to? People at this age, there's a psychosocial development sort of thing that shows us what people value and focus on at different stages in their lives. And at this age group, in our current time period, at least, people tend to focus on, what have I done that's made an impact on the world? And, how is what my actions, how is that going to impact future generations for the better? What kind of legacy am I going to leave? And basically, it's always thinking mostly about, have I done something worthwhile in my life to be proud of, to impact society in a good way? And so Abram's looking back over his life. The previous chapter, he's just saved his nephew from some armies, and God's blessed him through this priest, and there's all these other things that have happened. God's taken him on this really cool journey. But if you think of it from Abram's perspective at this point, all he's done so far is just walk around like a nomad for his whole life. And that's it. Like, he doesn't have a kid to pass on all his wealth that, God has given him abundance and, just overflowed him with blessings through this time of walking around like a nomad. God said, I will take you to this place that I will show you, but he never like really told him, all right, this is where you get to pitch a tent and actually build a house now, and fill it with kids, basically. Like, that never quite happened for Abraham. And so he's thinking, oh dear, have I just followed this God around for nothing? Like, what is the point of all this? And God comes to him and says, hey, I'm the point of all this. And Abram's like, but I want a kid. And who am I going to give all this stuff to? And so this is kind of where this whole story begins. And he says, yeah, I'm going to give all my stuff to my servant, because I guess he's probably my best mate. And there's no one else to inherit all this stuff. So I'll just write him into the will, I guess. And God says, no, this one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body will be your heir. And so this is a pretty big thing. Like, God's telling a pretty old guy, you're going to have a kid and he will be your heir, and everything that you've just cried to me about is not going to come true. Like, this is all basically been anxiety for nothing. And so, yeah. So he brought him outside and said, look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. So now it's nighttime, and God's brought him outside and said, originally, all right, I'm the thing you're looking for. However, I am going to give you a kid. I am going to fulfill this human desire of yours. And it's also for a reason that I have up my sleeve that I'm not really going to let you in on entirely at this point. And says, I'm going to give you a kid, and then I'm going to give you so many descendants, like for thousands of generations, that you're not going to be able to count them all. Like, if you try and look at the stars, you could probably count about 5,000 of them. That's how many we could see with the naked eye. And yet, if you point a telescope at just a single one of them, then that would probably expand, a lot of them expand into an entire galaxy, which obviously have millions and billions more stars. And so the closer that you look at this, the more that there is to it. And so God's saying, I'm going to give you so many descendants that if you try to count them all, and if you try to really, really focus in on how many there are, it's just going to keep on going forever. You're not going to be able to count them all. It's just impossible. Like, there is so much abundance that you cannot number. It's like when Joseph was the prime minister of Egypt, God gave them so much grain in the 7 years of plenty that they had to stop counting it, because they ran out of space to keep the records, and there was just too much to count. And like, the Egyptians like counting stuff. So, there's so much abundance when God comes in. He's like, I want to bless you so, 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 so much. And just trust me, like, you're not going to be able to keep a track of it right now. So, yeah. God is starting off with this really cool promise, saying, I'm going to give you so much that it is going to be impossible for you to understand how much of a blessing it is. And then it says in verse 6 that Abram believed in the Lord, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. And so I like this. It shows us the direct link between faith and trust and believing in God, and how that brings us to a place of righteousness. So there's a lot of big theological words that we could discuss in this moment. But obviously we know that we have our salvation because Jesus died on the cross for us, and we believe that ends our sin, basically. And, God sees us as righteous. But it only takes one thing from us, and that is just accepting, receiving, and believing that is the case. And that's the same thing that's going on here, 2,000-3,000 years before Jesus came to die. And it's actually about 2,000 years. And yeah, it just shows us that faith in whatever God says, that is what brings us, yeah, in this place of righteousness with him. So, where's the next point? Okay, so we're going to look at the covenant itself. So we've just looked at the first part of this chapter. So God says, I'm going to give you a kid, I'm going to give you heaps and heaps of descendants, and Abram believes it. And so that's pretty straightforward. But the next part is where it gets a little bit crazy. Like there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of stuff going on that can be very, very, very difficult to understand. So the second part is about the promised land. Got my notes over here. If you see me peering, that's what's going on. Okay, and then God said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. So he starts off by saying, this is who I am. This is the same God that you've been following around for, decades now, wandering around. And yeah, so I'm the same God that you've been following around for all this time. And I am actually going to give you this land to inherit it. I can't remember off the top of my head if God says, so in chapter 12, this is when God first calls Abraham. He says, now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Okay, so basically that is when God first calls him, and he says, I'll take you to a land that I will show you to make you a great nation, and then all the other blessings that come with that. But in this passage, he's actually saying you're going to inherit this land. He's more specific with the terminology. He says this land will belong to you and your descendants from now on. You're not just going to be walking around on somebody else's land anymore. This belongs to you now, basically. And then Abram says to him, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? So God said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, and a partridge in a pear tree. Why not? No, not really. So what's going on here? Like, why is God asking Abram to bring him a bunch of animals? What's up with that? Like, why? What's he doing there? So what we saw in verse 8, Abram's asking, how will I know that this is true? Which is different to the first part of the chapter where he's just like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just believe that God's going to give me a kid, even though I'm too old to have one. Sure, I'll go with that. And then here, when it's about land, which is pretty easy, I guess, comparatively, it doesn't require quite as big of a miracle, in my mind at least. Abram is saying, how do I know that I'm going to inherit it? Like, how do I know this is true? And so I guess if you look at it from like a business transaction sort of thing, like it doesn't require a business transaction for Abraham to have a son. That requires a different kind of relationship entirely. But this, when you talk about land, when you talk about possessions, it's more of a business transaction. And so there was a very particular way that people in the ancient Near East, the people of this time and place, would do business transactions. And when it came to a big promise, all right, let's go like this. So in the ancient Near East, there were lots and lots of kings. There were people who were in charge of like a town or a city or a small group of towns. And then there were some kings who were, emperors who ruled multiple countries because they had gone and conquered a bunch of places. And so there were kings of varying levels of status, of power and importance. And so sometimes there would be a lesser king who had a couple of small towns, and he would go and ask the king with more power, more towns, more countries under him, who had more military power. And the lesser king would say to the greater king, and he would be like, oh, I'll give you taxes and you give me your military power and look after me when another country who's not allied with us, they come to attack me. You come in, you swoop in and save me and send your troops, basically. And so that would be a suzerain and vassal treaty. So the vassal is, if I recall correctly, I think the vassal is the lesser king and the suzerain is the greater king. I could have them confused. It doesn't really matter. But basically, it would be a lesser going to a greater saying, hey, let's get into this relationship. I'll give you taxes or whatever, and you give me your support, and let's cut a covenant. And so when they would say, let's cut a covenant, they would, the cutting part always referred to some depiction of death. So they would either use, and this could be, human to human covenants or God to human covenants. The human to human covenants always invoked the gods to be witnesses of their covenants. They would be like, all right, this is my side of the bargain, this is my side of the bargain. And if we don't keep it, either one of us, if this guy doesn't keep the bargain, his side of the bargain, then he's like, all right, gods, you're allowed to strike me dead, basically. I'm going to die because this is such an important thing that we're discussing here that neither one of us wants to break the oath. And if one of us does happen to be sneaky and tries to break the oath, then there has to be some way to enforce that. And, the only way is the gods to enforce it. And that would be just like strike you dead. So this is like the general, very broad ancient Near East perspective on this, not just like the Israelite perspective or, the Egyptian perspective. This is like what everyone in general kind of believed. And how they thought, how they processed their ideas. And so when God says, bring me a bunch of animals, then, actually, it doesn't even say God tells them to cut them in two. Like Abraham knows what's going on. And so he cuts them in two, down the middle, placed each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. I don't know why he didn't cut the birds in two. I haven't looked that closely into this story, but from what I do know, so from what I understand, when he cuts them in two, he like cuts them from head to tail, basically in half, and then splits them down the middle, puts one on this side of the ground, one on this side of the ground, and like lines all these half carcasses up on the ground. And then there's like an aisle down the middle. And so having these two halves of the animals, this is what is representing death in this particular transaction, in this covenant cutting ceremony. So God says, bring me these animals, and then Abram brings them and he cuts them in half and he lays them down with an aisle down the middle, basically. And then the vultures came down on the carcasses and Abram drove them away. So first of all, the animals that God was asking him to bring were all clean animals according to ceremonial law, even though at this point, ceremonial law wasn't really written down. Like Moses didn't exist for like another 400 years until this point. And so there was no like temple rites that were written down. But we even see like back in the Garden of Eden and before the flood, that there was this idea of clean animals, like the lamb that was slain, and then the animals that entered the ark, there was 2 of each unclean animal, but 7 of each clean animal. So they had this idea of clean and unclean before ceremonial law even happened or was written. And so, God is asking him to bring these 5 animals, which are a heifer, which is a female cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, which is a male goat, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So all of these 5 animals are used in various parts of temple ceremonial law. So they're all clean animals. But then the vultures are actually unclean animals. We read in Leviticus and I think somewhere else, possibly Deuteronomy, something like that, that we're not supposed to eat those types of animals because they're unclean, because they go and eat other carcasses. They eat, dead, decaying flesh, and it's really unhealthy. But there's more to it. There's like a spiritual aspect that is associated with these animals. Like the people in the ancient Near East would associate certain types of animals with certain spiritual things. It's just the way that they processed their ideologies. They just saw things in the natural world and they would associate them with spiritual things. Like today, I've expressed this in, I think, the Lydia video, but like today we see things very compartmentalized. There's geology, there's geography, there is, you know, English studies, there's all these different things, and we just completely separate them all. But in the ancient Near East, like this Eastern sort of thinking, everything is all kind of tied up together. It's all very mysteriously linked together, and they can't really separate it in their thinking. And that's great, but that's something that's hard for us to understand, and something we have to be aware of when we read the Bible, that they're seeing all of this stuff linked together in ways that we wouldn't naturally. So that's a bit about the animals. They're associated with spiritual things. There's a lot of depth of understanding around them. And so Abram is driving these vultures away. Have you ever seen a vulture before? They're huge and they're ugly, and they have like big talons and sharp beaks for, you know, cutting and ripping into flesh. And so Abram's there. I don't know if he had a big stick or if he got a bunch of rocks off the ground. He's out in the desert and he's got all these carcasses lying down on the ground, just starting to stink, baking in the sun. And these vultures, I'm imagining like 6 or 7 vultures, are swirling around up in the air and coming to fly down and rip at the flesh of these animals. And he's like, you know, chasing them away and trying to throw the rocks at them, beat them up with sticks, probably bash them with his arms. I don't know what he was doing. I bet he probably got a little bit cut up himself by the talons and the beaks and all of that. It probably would not have been a fun experience, and he would have probably gotten pretty exhausted. Like, here's a 75-year-old man chasing away some giant birds that are trying to eat his, you know, random ceremonial animals that are just lying on the ground. Easy prey. And so eventually it says that it says that Abram drove them away. So it finally worked. He finally managed to get rid of them. So now when the sun was going down, so this whole process of this entire chapter is taking probably a whole day long. So at the start, God takes them out to look at the stars, so it's dark enough for them to be stars, either early morning or middle of the night or whatever. And now it's been daytime again, and now the sun is beginning to set. And I'm imagining that this would probably be around 3 p.m. Like, we probably don't think of the sun beginning to set until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then it starts turning into golden hour, and then, you know, the sun starts getting that orange kind of glow for a little while. So the sun is beginning to set, and 3 o'clock in the afternoon is actually when they would do the evening sacrifice. So in the temple ceremony, they would be doing an evening sacrifice of the lamb every day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I don't know for certain if this is exactly when this began, but I could imagine, from a storytelling point of view at least, that is probably when the sun is beginning to go down and this next part happens. So it says in verse 12, "Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him." So that doesn't sound very pleasant at all. And I did a little bit of research into this, like, why was there darkness and great horror? And we see darkness in the scriptures in a spiritual sort of sense, and like a visionary type of sense, a few times. Like when Jesus died on the cross, everything went dark for a while. And a few other places I've forgotten off the top of my head, but there are different like spiritual meanings attached to this darkness that it could represent. And the overall theme from what I've read is it could be representing, I guess, the distinction between humanity's sinfulness, or just the sinful nature of the fallen world, compared to the glory of God, which is about to show up in the second. It could be that, but we don't really know. I don't know why he for certain, you know, experienced this deep, deep darkness and horror. Oh, another moment of darkness just popped into my mind was in Egypt during the 10 plagues of Egypt, as the Israelites are going through the Exodus, there's this deep darkness that falls over the Egyptian part of Egypt, whereas the Israelites who live there in the same place at the same time, they're not experiencing that deep darkness. It's like this removal of God's presence from those people. Yeah. But we don't know for certain if that is exactly what it represents in this place. There's just go research it. Let me know. Go do your research. Come back and tell me what you think in the comments of what you think the darkness might represent and the horror. So, moving on. Where is it? Okay. So in verse 13, then God said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age." All right, I'll start off with that last little part where you shall go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. So that basically just means you will go to your death in peace. Your father's, he's 75 now. His dad's probably dead. His grandparents, his grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers, obviously. His ancestors are obviously all dead. And so that euphemism of your fathers, go to your fathers, just means you will go to your death in peace. So basically God said, all right, there's going to be some pretty sucky stuff that happens down the line in your descendants' lives, but you're not going to experience that. Just letting you know what's going to happen so you can pass down this information to them and they will have some light at the end of the tunnel to hold on to, some kind of hope, but you're not going to have to go through it. You're going to have a good old life. Okay, so he says, before that he was saying, your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs and will serve them. So basically be slaves to them. And they will afflict them for 400 years. So for 400 years, Abraham's descendants are going to be slaves. And that's not going to be a very fun experience for them at all. And basically this is like when we look at it and try to, see which part of history that has happened so far, like this applies to. It's obviously the 400 years that the Israelites were in Egypt, and then they came out during the Exodus. And when they did come out, they came out with a lot of the Egyptian wealth. Like the Egyptians were giving them their wealth, saying, please leave us alone. We're so over these, these, what are they called? Like the pestilences, plagues. Plagues, I said it a minute ago. God is saying your descendants are going to go basically to Egypt for 400 years. He doesn't say which, place to Abram, but we see it was Egypt. They're going to be there for about 400 years. They're not going to have a fun time while they're there. They're going to be in slavery. They're going to be in bondage, in affliction. And then I'm going to judge that nation. So God is bringing his people into a place that eventually will need to be judged. And there's a whole bunch that we could get into about that, like why God allows certain things to happen in our lives that are just horrible, but it's not even about us, but it's actually about the other people involved sometimes, and how us being in that situation is going to affect them, or how God is going to use us in that situation to judge them if that's what he is going to do. I don't know if that happens so much on a smaller scale now, but there's certainly a lot more depth that we can dig into about why do these things go on in our lives? Like, what is it even about? And so God is telling him, your descendants are going to be there for 400 years. They're going to be afflicted. Then they're going to come out and they're going to have great possessions. So they're going to go from slave to rich guys real quick, like overnight, basically. Afterwards, they shall come out with great possessions and you're going to be fine. All right, in verse 16, but in the fourth generation, they shall return here. So this is, after 400 years, in the fourth generation, they shall return here to this land, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And this is, I guess, similar to the Egyptian thing of the Egyptians were to be judged after 400 years, but then also the Amorites are going to be judged, I guess, in 400 years as well, as we see, you know, in the taking over of the promised land in Joshua's time and the judges. The Amorites were very, very sinful group of people. They had a lot of stuff that they were doing that was super hurtful and harmful, and their sin at this point, 400 years prior to their judgment, by the sounds of it, from what God is saying, their sin had not yet quite ripened, hadn't quite matured to its fullness. And the word here is actually iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And iniquity is, so there's iniquity and transgressions. So there's sin, and under sin, as a broad idea, there is iniquity and transgressions. Iniquity is inward and transgression is outward. So iniquity is the inward thoughts like lust or, hate, which, God says is murder. And all these things, all that stuff that is within us. And it can also, I think, be within society, like within that group, in that society. It can be just that system that is built up in that place at large, because sin can be within one person, or a sin can be like this ingrained system within a group of people, like within a country. So God is saying that the iniquity, the inward ways of doing things that is against God's will, is not yet complete for the Amorites. And so he's going to wait for 400 years to judge the Egyptians, whether their sin is complete yet or not. And then he's going to wait 400 years because the Amorites will probably be ripe around about then. So yeah, he brings them in, he judges the Amorites. He's planning to, and that's what he's saying. And in verse 17 it says, "And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces." Okay, so we've gone from the sun is setting at the beginning of this horror and darkness, and God is starting to talk, and then now the sun has set and it's dark already. So when God speaks to us, I know this for certain for myself, we obviously, most of us do not spend enough time in his presence to actually listen. And God just took probably 3 hours just to say those 2 sentences. We really need to spend more time just taking in what he has to say to us, putting more time aside and slowing down to hear his message. But, that's just a slight little side note. It is in there, but, take that, pray about it, see what God wants you to do with that little nugget. So yeah, now that the sun went down and it was dark, there was this smoking oven and burning torch that passed between those pieces. So what is that about? What is this smoking pot and burning torch? Like when my lecturer at uni taught me about this about 3 years ago, it just blew my mind. Like, how have I never seen this before? What is that? What is going on? And we have a big fancy word for this, and it's called a theophany. And theophany is any time that God turns up in a physical, tangible, visual type of way. And just comes as himself, but in this way. So the burning bush that Moses saw, that's a theophany. That was God in a physical kind of form, speaking, he was visual. He was like, this is an actual physical space that is holy. Take your shoes off. Another time was when later down the track, God comes to visit Abraham and Sarah and have a meal with them, and was in physical human form, and Abraham feeds him, and he actually eats the food. And another time is when Daniel's friends, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they are thrown into the fiery furnace, but instead of getting burnt up, they're actually walking around with this 4th person, which looks like the Son of God, and it is God, and it's him in a physical human form showing up in the world for whatever reason he chooses. And so, and another time was when during the Exodus, the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire, that would be another theophany of God's presence, like that cloud that would hover over the mountain of God. All of these very physical, tangible ways to represent God, but it wasn't just representing, it was him in a way. Yeah. So there is this fire pot, this oven, this burning torch that passed between the pieces. And so this is just another representation. I just imagine it as like a ball of flame, just kind of floating through between these pieces. And that, like the passing between the pieces. So this brings us back to the covenant itself and what kind of a covenant it even was. So God is the one who is calling for this covenant, right? Abram asks, how do I know you're going to give me all this stuff? Give me this land to inherit. And as a business transaction of sorts between God and Abram, God is like, okay, bring me these animals. And Abram brings them. He knows that this is a transaction going on. So he chops them up, gets them ready for this covenant. But then he passes out. Like after he shoos the vultures away, he's just lying there, passed out the whole time in this deep, dark vision of horror and hearing what God is saying. And then God, in his ball of flame theophany, is floating through these pieces. So Abram doesn't do any of the covenant ritual part himself. He provides the animals, and then that's it. Like he keeps them, keeps the birds shooed away, and that's all he does. He doesn't go through it. He doesn't say any of this is my responsibility to uphold, because God is the one who called for it. God is the one who said, I'm going to give you this thing. You're not asking me for anything really. I am choosing to give this to you and to show you I'm serious and I will uphold my word. I'm going to go through this covenant ritual with you, but you're not going to do any of the covenant ritual walking through the pieces to show that the death is going to come upon you if you don't uphold your end of the bargain. God says, I'm going to uphold my end of the bargain. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to show you that if I don't, then I'm going to die. Like, how is God going to die? Like, I don't understand why he did that anyway, but like he was so serious about this covenant that he went through the full-on the ritual with him, and he fully took every part of the responsibility on himself. It wasn't 50% this person, 50% this person. It was 100% on God's shoulders for this promise to come to pass. And hold on. Had a thought and it ran away for 2 seconds. Let me go catch it. So he makes this covenant and he walks between it and he takes it all upon himself. And then he says, to your descendants, I've given this land. And then he describes the land. It's from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates and everyone in between, basically, who lives in this land of Canaan. He describes that everywhere that these people live, these people or this land now belongs to you. So he fully describes it. He fully steps out the land, like we discussed in the Ruth and Boaz video briefly about, did I bring up the shoe thing? About stepping on it and saying, yes, we both know these parties. Actually, that just popped into my head right now. This makes so much sense. So with that thing that I discussed in the Ruth and Boaz video very briefly about, we both of us two parties have stepped on this land. We both know exactly what it is that we're discussing. So all we have to do is take off our shoe and give it to you as this transactional thing. So way before this, God is calling Abram to wander around on this land and know every inch of it, basically, and say, go and wander around. Just go check it out. It's a pretty good piece of land. And at the end of all that wandering, or maybe not the full end, but, God's like, the land that we're talking about now, the one that you've been walking around for a long time, that's the one I'm giving to you. So actually, I never even saw that until just this moment. But that works. So, that's basically, I think, pretty much. Oh no, there's one more thing. Oops, everything's moving. Oh dear. So basically, this whole one-sided covenant thing is what I really, really wanted to get at. That God, as much as he expects us to continue to be in a relationship with him, to continue growing with him, to continue going through that sanctifying process with him, like, he makes us promises and he doesn't actually expect too much of us. in the process. Like, he wants to bless us because he wants to bless us. That's the kind of God that we love and serve. And when he made this promise to Abraham, he didn't tell him, you know, you have to take some of the responsibility to make sure it all happens. Otherwise, the deal is off. Like, God just took it upon himself, and he kept his promise, and there has been abundance and blessing. And I just love that about our God. Like, he's really cool, and he's so full of love and mercy and just overflowing with blessings. And yeah, so I think that's about everything I had to say. If I know there's a few people on here, if you would like to say hello or tell me something that you learnt or something that you'd like to hear about next week, let me know. I'll wait for a couple of seconds. And yeah, keen to hear. And if you don't have something to say, that's cool too. It's been really great hanging out with you guys. Thank you for joining me for my very first live. It was a little bit scary, but I could tell that when my technology was not working for me the last few hours and wasn't uploading the video I already did, then I really felt like God was like, no, you should probably do a live. So I was like, oh dear, here we go. All right, well, that's basically it for me today. I will see you again next Friday. Oh, thanks, Dennis. Yeah, thanks for saying great job. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for hanging out. We'll see you next week. Bye.